War forced them to leave their country. Now a number of Iraqi refugees in Europe are being forced to return. Just why are they being deported now? Has the situation in Iraq improved? And will that country's immediate neighbours follow the European lead? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mike Hanna. Dozens of Iraqi refugees are being forced to go back home. The Netherlands, Britain, Norway and Sweden has rejected many asylum claims, and what could be the first in a series of deportations is now underway. These countries argue Iraq is now safe enough for those not facing specific threats to return. However, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR, begs to differ. It says the situation in Iraq is still volatile. And while the level of violence is not as high as it was in 2007, there has been a sharp increase in recent months following national elections. And the UNHCR says it remains concerned about Iraq's human rights record. The Iraqi diaspora is one of the largest in modern times. The UN has described it as a humanitarian crisis. To date, more than 4.5 million Iraqis have been uprooted. While 2.5 million of them are internally displaced, over 2 million found refuge abroad. Out of that, only some 100,000 Iraqis submitted asylum claims within the EU, and most of them have been unsuccessful. Germany has close to 40,000 Iraqi refugees. Sweden is home to another 40,000, according to the government. 460 Iraqis have been deported in the last 2 years, while over 4,000 have returned voluntarily after being denied asylum. Netherlands has more than 15,000 Iraqi refugees, but the government has tightened its policy after public opinion became increasingly opposed to immigration. Those campaigning against the forced deportation agree with some of the UNHCR's concerns.
How many people have to die, because we have some victims, people lost their lives after they have been sent. So how many people have to be died to make them believe it's a dangerous situation?
Nala, Bushra, two voices among thousands of others. In fact, more than 165,000 Iraqi refugees currently registered by the United Nations Refugee Agency in Syria, and for whom heading back home is simply not an option. I die 100 times a day, my husband too, but we have to think of the children and their future. Our only hope is resettlement. We can't go back to Iraq. We've asked for resettlement in the United States, but what will happen to the boys? They cry every night. We can't go back. There are too many memories in Iraq. I never imagined things could get so bad. Well, joining us today are our guests. In Birmingham, Aravan Mohammed is an Iraqi refugee who's appealing against a UK deportation order. In London, Peter Kessler, Senior External Affairs Officer for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR. And in Brussels, Hugo Brady, Senior Research Fellow on European Union Institutions and Home Affairs at the Centre for European Reform. Welcome all. Let's begin in London. Peter Kessler, these deportations on the face of it would appear to counter UN guidelines.
They certainly do. UNHCR is very concerned. We have protested to the British government on this occasion, and of course last autumn when a similar deportation took place of some 40 people, of whom eventually only approximately a quarter left got off the aircraft in Baghdad. And of course we've done the same with other European governments. It does seem that with today's return of simultaneously of 4 countries that Europe is presenting a united face, and our message is that still central Iraq is not appropriate for returns such as these forced returns, and the numbers are so small that indeed these individuals can still be accommodated in Europe even if they've exhausted their asylum claims, because it is too dangerous to send people back.
Let's go to Hugo Brady in Brussels. And the decision to deport the refugees, the citing is the security situation has improved in Iraq. Is this the only reason, do you believe, for this return, this forced return?
Well, I think you touched on it in your opening statement. I mean, today there's a general election in the Netherlands, and the issue of immigration and linked to immigration, asylum and refugee claims has become an increasingly politicised issue. in popular opinion in several European countries. And when you see even Sweden beginning to toughen up its position, you know it's really hitting home at an electoral level.
Aravan Mohammed, in Birmingham, we are talking about you and people like you. Why do you think it is not appropriate for you to return to Iraq at this time?
I would like to start with today's speech of Mr. Cameron when one of the honourable MPs asked him about unlawful enforcement deportation about Iraqi people, because one of the flights just started today back to Baghdad. I would like to ask Mr. Cameron, do you believe, as you said, Iraq is safe and security being improved? Will you go to Iraq and stay in Baghdad without security guard? And can you go on the street without fear of your life? Any car bomb, any terrorist, any militias attacking you and kidnapping you and asking for ransom or possibly killing you. So therefore, there is certain places in Iraq are really not safe. As you see, every day is killing on the Baghdad street, on Kirkuk, in Mosul, even in north of Iraq. One journalist, he just, Mr. Zardasht, he just write an article about Mr. Barzani. He's being assassinated and he's being killed. So which kind of security they are talking about? Unless is a political agenda in behind of that. These all economic crises happen in Europe, they are trying to blame poor asylum seekers. Of course, most of the asylum peoples are here. They want to work and they want to contribute to the economy, but these things happening in Europe, you shouldn't have to blame asylum seekers with they have fear of life. That's why they flee from the country in the first place.
Well, let's look at the reality on the ground. The decision to deport Iraqi refugees came in the wake of the most recent UK Foreign Office statement, which is warning against all travel to Iraq, particularly Baghdad. Suicide bombings and sectarian violence continue to cause devastation more than 7 years after the war. In May, a car bomb killed 30 and it injured more than 50 in the northern province of Diyala. This attack followed a wave of nationwide violence that left well over 100 people dead. The failure to form a government after the March elections has, in the eyes of many observers, created a vacuum of power that's being filled by those intent on fomenting instability. And most recently, a spate of bombings and shootings around the country left 11 dead, many of whom were civilians. Let me go back to Aravan Mohammed. And we understand that when you had your interview about deportation, there were Iraqi members present during that interview. Is that correct?
Is that correct? Yes. Basically, when I had the interview, an immigration officer denied me to access to my representative, legal representative. I pleased him to just let me to bring my legal representative with me, because you are facing me to be interviewed with some peoples which you are putting my life in danger in. But basically, he denied that. After when I went to the interview, I basically told them we are living in UK and I would prefer the interview has to run with an English language. The Interior Ministry diplomat, he became annoyed in some point in the interview and he shouted at me, is a CCTV over there, you can't check it out, anybody can check it if they request it from a Brokehouse Detention Center. And he told me, I know what I'm going to do with you by the time you're returning back home, and I know where I will put you and how I treat you. So don't you think that's a threat in the middle of the democracy, like a country like UK, Iraqi diplomats threatening me by the time I will return back to Iraq? He's simply telling me I will put you in hidden prison or secret prison and I will kill you later.
Well, let's take this up with Peter Kessler in London. And this is an issue to clarify, Peter. This interview took place at the United Kingdom Border Agency. This is part of an official UK structure. But the idea of those from the country that people are being deported back to present at these questionings is pretty unprecedented, is it not?
Well, Mike, we're surprised by the initiative. But indeed, for one, of course, the individuals may well have exhausted the asylum claims process. It doesn't mean they don't have protection needs, which is why in the case of central Iraq, we're suggesting that people be allowed to stay. But indeed, it appears that by bringing Iraqi government officials to the immigration removal centers, the UK border agency wants to prevent another debacle as they experienced last October, when they had a plane load of people flying into Iraq and only about 20% of the passengers were allowed off because there were disputes regarding the nationality and areas of origin of the detainees of most of the detainees on that flight. So it's a new initiative, and it's an indication of the resolve and creativity of the UK border agency. Our concern, of course, is, as you suggested, the message it's sending to countries in the region that host the vast majority of Iraqis abroad, and what these returns on the part of a few European governments might do to spur other governments hosting far many more Iraqis in terms of sending people back.
We'll return to that point in a moment, but first I'd like to speak to Hugo Brady. The reality is that if one EU country takes a decision, then it's going to apply to all, and yet there's no common EU policy as yet on the question of deportations, forced or otherwise.
That's correct. The EU has tried several times and failed for over the last 10 to 15 years to come up with a list of countries which it's safe to automatically return failed asylum claimants to. And it's certainly in the case of Iraq, which is so hugely politicized and to which the Europeans have linked responsibility, there is little common agreement. Asylum policy in the EU, in any case, is incredibly contentious issue. There are problems with trying to apply a common policy across the whole territory of the EU. You have a situation where a country like Sweden has, as you said at the beginning, around 40,000 Iraqi refugees resident there. Other countries such as Greece or Slovakia have zero, none. So you see that the fiction of a common policy where all countries are following the same guidelines is being cruelly exposed. When you put into that mix the politics of what happens if the European countries are seen to be cracking down on asylum, and in effect they've been cracking down on asylum for quite some time, they will say back to you, well, we apply the Geneva Convention. We have to have a believable asylum system that the public have faith in, that isn't just a backdoor for those who are economic migrants, etc. In the case of Iraqis, that argument is almost impossible to make. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place. But what they will say is that it's the responsibility of not just European countries, but all countries who are signatories to the Geneva Convention, which is basically everyone in the UN, including Iraq's neighbours, to shoulder some of this burden, as indeed Syria has been doing.
Well, let's pick up on that particular point. There are enormous numbers of refugees in the state's immediate neighbour to Iraq. This total is higher than the number of refugees in all the EU countries combined. Let's take a quick look at the figures. It's estimated that more than 1 million Iraqis fled to Syria in the years after the 2003 war. The exact number of refugees in Jordan is unknown, but some estimates suggest the figure is close to 500,000, while Lebanon is host to in the region of 50,000 Iraqi refugees. And while these countries struggle to cope with the financial burden, the future of the refugees remains uncertain. Let's go back to Aravan Mohammed in Birmingham. Now, referring to that 2003 invasion, the event that led to most of the refugees leaving the country, the UK part of that, the US led that invasion. Now, there are 1,200 Iraqis have been given asylum in the US in the years since. As we are seeing there, we're looking at some 1 million in one of the immediate neighbours. Do you believe, as an Iraqi refugee, that the UK and the US have a special responsibility in this matter, having been part of what created the crisis in the first place?
Okay. First of all, the invasions which had happened, the invasion of Iraq by the US and Britain, it was unlawful. Basically, the United Nations condemned that. And the situation by 2003 was no blood on the Iraqi street. It was, yes, it was a torture in the Iraqi secret prison, not Iraqi Iraqi's security prisons, but we have got only one security prisons which we all scare from. But now there is every street and every ministry, they have got their own hidden prison, and they torture everyone who across their ideas. So yes, of course, US and Britain, they have got a bigger part and bigger share of care for the Iraqi refugees, because this situation now happened. 4 million Iraqis flee their country for of life, them created, and them are responsible to create the new Iraqi government. The election has been happening since 3 months, and now there is no government there. And there is nobody responsible, nobody take their responsibility to create a new government. And everyone taking their part, taking negotiation with a different party to get extra seat in the parliament. The political now become a trader. Everybody trading trading people, trading citizens, trading Iraqis, trading Iraqi refugees to get extra money. And of course, Britain, instead of enforcing refugees to return back to Iraq, he should take bigger part of responsibility toward Iraqis. I was qualified person when I was in Iraq, and I fled to UK, and now I'm studying a master's student in UK. So if I came here for money without fearing of my life, I don't need to stay in UK. There is many places I can work in. So obviously, yes, they have to take bigger part.
Peter Kessler, in London, there is a convention, a refugee convention, UN convention, that has been in force since 1951. That's well over 50 years. Now, many of these nations, in fact, all of them, are signatories to that convention. And yet there are individual interpretations of what that means. Does that perhaps lie at the bottom of this problem, this argument that is being held at present?
Well, there's no debate about the kind of protection the 1951 Refugee Convention offers, which is to individuals who are fleeing persecution or fear of persecution. And as you suggested earlier, even if a country hasn't signed the convention, or I believe it was actually Hugo Brady suggested, even if a country hasn't signed the convention, of course, international practice and, of course, law means that the right to asylum can be guaranteed. Everyone has a right to access asylum, and everyone who needs asylum should receive protection, even if their country isn't a signatory. And let us remember that even those Middle Eastern countries that haven't signed the Refugee Convention have long respected the right to refuge, and of course offer protection to, for example, many millions of Palestinians. So clearly the Middle East is very hospitable. It's the European countries that indeed, while the numbers in recent years of Iraqi asylum seekers have been significant in places like Sweden, like the UK, clearly they are nowhere near as significant as in the greater Middle East. We're talking right now about 10 people being flown out of the UK, perhaps similar numbers from the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, perhaps more to come in the coming weeks. Now, these are manageable numbers of people who can be housed here in Europe until it is safer for them to go back. And of course, the absorption capacity in central Iraq in particular, where there are still bombings, there is still insecurity, and police protection and the judiciary are still not fully in place, is such that it's better that people not be forced back at this time.
Well, Hugo Brady, to pick up on a point that was touched on earlier, and that is the issue of precedent. In the European Union members' decisions, is there, do you believe, a wider view at any stage taken, the fact that this could be a signal to those who have far more refugees within their borders, and those are the states neighbouring Iraq? Is there any thought within European Union deliberations about the wider impact of what is a narrow decision in their case?
It's always difficult to judge the, if you like, foreign policy impact of a decision which many member states will justify as being one solely of internal or home affairs. My feeling is, honestly, I feel that the main issue here is probably the spread of that these countries were actually, at least some of them, quite good about taking large numbers of Iraqi refugees. Now they're clearly sending the signal that the door is closing for economic and other reasons one can only assume or presume. And what I'd be more worried about is the dragging down of the average standard in Europe. If countries outside Europe use the EU, the rather poor example that we're seeing at the moment, they can justifiably claim that this is another example of Western hypocrisy, and why should they, at a time of global economic crisis, not just European, not just American, why should they shoulder the burden unfairly of a war which they did not initiate? It's a pretty overwhelming argument, I'm afraid. I just hope that it won't be deployed.
Peter Kessler, very briefly, your view of that argument, the economic imperative outweighing any political decision or indeed humanitarian?
Well, clearly, of course, European countries are trying to demonstrate to their taxpayers that they are being strong and firm on asylum. But in regard to people fleeing from central Iraq, this is a very poor example to take. It's a country with widespread violence. It's not the time to be sending people back, and indeed, Europe can, of course, improve its asylum systems, improve its consideration of and its way of dealing with immigration. But sending people back to areas where they can be at risk should not be undertaken by any country, either in Europe or elsewhere.
Aravan Mohammed, it sounds as though, to a very large degree, you and so many other Iraqi refugees are pawns in this. Who do you think should decide when you should return home?
Basically, returning home, it would be a last option for me, because I believe in the basis of the human right. I'm creating the family over here, and there is 100 Iraqis, they have a family over here. If they are breaching my right by not granting me staying here, I believe my family, my children's, my wife has the right to keep me with her. And it's impossible to take in some people to Iraq, even despite I fear of my life, and it's impossible to cope in the Iraqi society. As everybody knows, the European peoples, they have got different way of life, and they have got different way of thinking. So there is breaking of the family and the breaking of the family on the society basis, because Mr. Cameron himself was mentioning in several times that is UK is going through the break-in society. So I'm asking Mr. Cameron, by deporting Iraqis which have a family in this country, is he gathering the family together, or he's making the break worse? So obviously, returning back to Iraq after I've been threatened by the Iraqi's Interior Ministry, I believe my life is in danger. And if they didn't kill me, or if they didn't kill me, I will be sure facing highest or biggest torture.
Appropriate to have the final voice of somebody who is directly affected by the decisions being taken by politicians. My thanks to our guests, Peter Kessler in London, Hugo Brady in Brussels, and Aravan Mohammed in Birmingham. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.